Buenos días. Antes que nada quisiera agradecer a nuestros invitados de la Embajada Británica y a Sir Robert King, que es el invitado que nos va a dar la presentación. Nosotros que estamos organizando este evento somos del Observatorio La Paz, ¿Cómo vamos? Es una institución conformada por el Programa de Ayuda a la Democracia Municipal, el PADEM, la Fundación para el Periodismo, la Cámara Nacional de Comercio y la Universidad Nuestra Señora de la Paz. Nosotros lo que tratamos de hacer es influir un poco en la efectividad y eficacia de los gobiernos municipales, y para esto hacemos una serie de tareas. Tratamos de contribuir al debate con una serie de análisis, estudios, en otras ocasiones, como es el caso de hoy día, trayendo invitados que puedan aportar a las ideas que manejamos aquí en La Paz y a cómo podemos seguirnos desarrollando, ¿no? También tratamos de promover la ciudadanía, una ciudadanía más informada, más responsable y más participativa, por medio precisamente de estos eventos. También tratamos de generar alianzas entre los actores más importantes en cada sector. Una de las cosas que realizamos es una encuesta
This meant looking at obesity, which is a big problem in our country. It meant looking at infectious diseases. When I came into office, we had the world's biggest foot and mouth disease epidemic. Right? It meant also looking at flood defenses for the United Kingdom. This was the first project I chose. Now, the reason I chose that project was because the biggest challenge from climate change in Britain. Hello?
Sorry.
Rewind.
A little bit.
You've been translated. Okay. So, the biggest challenge from climate change in Britain, I realized before we started this project, is from flooding. And so we set up, it was about 120 engineers, private experts, building experts, etc., to look at the impact of flooding in the United Kingdom, not for the next 5 years, but out to 2008. So looking long term. Why long term? If you look at the history of Britain, we had massive floods in 1926 in London. And the discussion began in the political system, and finally we built a system to manage the floods of London. Believe it or not, that system first came into work in 1980. So between 26 and 80 was a very long time. Infrastructure of this magnitude takes a long time to decide on and to. So the Thames Barrier is what I'm talking about. Now, when we designed the Thames Barrier, it was expected we would use it once every 6 years to save London from flooding. In this last December, January period, we had the worst floods on record, and it was used 52 times in that period. If one of those floods had broken into London, my estimate is that the loss, the damage, cost to London would have been of the order of 200 to 300 billion pounds. As it happens, the damage to the country from the floods was about 1 billion. This was the outcome of this program of work. We began spending as a country an additional £500 million a year on improving flood defences and on improving flood water management. And the cities and towns of Britain were completely saved from the floods as a result of that program. So the first thing is, foresight meant looking out into the future, and what we realized was rising sea levels, changing levels of storms at sea and storms on land, meant that we were highly at risk of flooding. And that program meant that flood water has to go somewhere, and we deflected every drop of flood water into areas we had designated as floodplains. The people in the floodplains were not too happy, and the people in the cities did not congratulate us. Right? So it's a situation where I had to go on television to explain what the hell I was doing, causing all this damage amongst the farming community, the people in the floodplain. But a choice had to be made. All of our major assets were saved during the biggest flood we've ever experienced. So it is just an example of foresight and force, but it's also an example of the impact of climate change. What we said back in 2004, when I reported to Parliament, was that unless we set up this program, our island would be, and the British live on islands, our island nation would be severely at threat for its very existence going forward in time. So the driver for Britain to lead the world on reducing greenhouse gas emissions and on adapting against climate change was precisely because we see it as an existential threat to our existence running forward. When I reported this to Parliament, there was not a single person who voted yes. We finally ended up with a Climate Change Act of Parliament in 2008, all-party agreement, And in that act, we committed Britain to reducing its emissions by 80% by 2050. And I will say more about this. So this comes from understanding the impacts of climate change on our society. Now, amongst all these things, you will see this intelligent infrastructure system. This was another piece of work that was focused on what modern technology, intelligent infrastructure system, could do to assist us in our urban environment. So this, for example, was looking primarily at transport and how we could facilitate the movement of traffic, mass transit, how we could plan forward over a period of 30 or 40 years. As soon as we come to infrastructure, and you are mainly experts in the built environment, that infrastructure you expect to be there for the next 50, 60 years. That means you have to be sure that it's going to be fit for purpose in 50 or 60 years' time. And that's what we were doing in many of these programs, looking out 50 years ahead and then coming back to action today. And it's not often that governments are looking beyond the next month, the next year, the next 10 years. But this program of work was looking 50 years ahead and then taking action today to see that we were more secure in the future. Now, what I'm going to suggest, and let me put this thesis to you directly, is that in the 21st century, we, by which I mean all of humanity, are faced with a series of challenges that are qualitatively different from the challenges we faced before. Qualitatively different. And I'm going to justify this as I talk through it. And I am focusing on cities primarily because the urban development is going to be the key parameter in whether or not we are going to be fit for purpose by the end of the 21st century. So here's the driver that changes everything. It's population dynamics, demographics. We entered this century at 6 billion people on the planet. At the beginning of the last century, we were 1.5 billion. Now, I want to say that a measure of our successes in the 20th century is the growth in the population. So I'm not criticizing the growth in the population. As human well-being improved, the population grew. Many more children were surviving into maturity than before, and necessarily that meant population explosion. On average in Britain, from the Middle Ages until the 19th century, the average woman had 7 or 8 children, but only 2 on average survived into maturity. When human well-being improves rapidly, women still had 7 or 8 children, 5 or 6 of it into maturity. That means population explosion. Not just that 5 or 6 added into the population, but that they get married and they have children. And so you get this rapid growth in population. Now it turns out that women are smarter than we think, in the sense that after 2 generations, and this applies country by country across the world, women no longer have 7 or 8 children. How many do they have? The average across the whole planet today is 2.2. Stunning. Right? When I give this number to most people, they ask me, well, what about the Arab countries? What about Bangladesh? Bangladesh is 2.3. And so every country is following this dynamic, this population dynamic. 2 or 3 generations on average for a woman, it's 2 children per family. And South America achieved that 2.1 children some time ago. So what we're seeing is that we're stabilizing the population. The remaining growth of the global population is simply due to the fact that we have a cohort of under 15-year-olds who are 2 billion on the planet. In 15 years' time, the under 15-year cohort will still be 2 billion. But as that cohort grows older, they're replacing a cohort at the top end that's only 1 billion. This is just the aging of the cohorts that's leading to this remaining dynamic. So we know there's going to be about 9 billion people. That's a given. That's what we are having to deal with, and we need to plan for that. Now I'm getting to the main point, because the demographic challenge is no longer population growth. Female education, female empowerment, availability of contraception have dealt with that problem. I know there's more to be done, but nevertheless, I'm going to generalize this and say that's a done problem. But underneath that is the big challenge of the 21st century. So we entered the century at just over 1 billion people who I'm describing as middle class. I'm saying people are middle class if they spend between $10 and $100 a day. Very quantitative description. Last year, we reached 2 billion. In the first 13 years of this century, we have already doubled the number of middle class consumers. And that's the key word. These people are consuming commodities. Right? 2 billion. That's opportunity if you sell commodities, but there are challenges. Now, I've projected that curve forward to 2030 based on all of the expectations from a whole range of economists around the world. And so the expectation is we approach 5 billion just in 15 years' time. 5 times as many middle-class people on the planet's surface as there were in the year 2000. Is the critical turning point. Good news. The good news is that already we've gone from 1/6 of the population having the well-being of the middle class to 2/7, and we're going to reach 5/8. That's the good news. The challenge is I'm not sure that we're capable of delivering that. In other words, this is an expectation curve based on rising GDP growth, largely in the Asia-Pacific region, but coming on rapidly behind them, Africa following through. So South America came through already. Now we're seeing the Asia-Pacific growth and the African growth of the middle class. Why is this key to cities? Most of these middle class people are urbanized. Right? So this is also reflected in this enormously rapid growth in urban development that we've got to anticipate over the coming few years, 15 years. Now, I don't believe that we're actually prepared for the challenges. Let me just set them out. In 2008, we passed half of the global population being in the cities. And in 2050, we're expecting 70%. Now, of course, that's also a rising baseline number, so we see that the challenge of the urban development is another 4 billion urban dwellers by 2050. This is a very short time span, and we have never had to face up to a change of that magnitude before. All right, so here's my carousel of simultaneous challenges, all driven by the demographics that I've been spelling out. So this is the reason why I'm saying we are faced with qualitatively new challenges. Each one of these represents a specific challenge. But the real challenge is that they're all coming at us at once, and these challenges are completely interactive. We can't actually separate food production from water usage, from land usage, etc. So what we have is a set of interactive challenges. In physics, we call this a many-body problem. And the many-body problem is always the hardest to deal with. Why? Let's just take water resource as an example. South Australia, if you look at a map of Australia, people usually show the south of Australia as green because it's a relatively high rainfall area, and it's an area therefore that is got productive farm. You have to use the past tense now. The state of Victoria has suffered 14 years of drought. The farmers have packed their bags. This is no longer a productive farming area. And so what you see happening in South Australia is people being challenged even to provide fresh water for the cities such as Melbourne and the towns of the state of Victoria. Water provision into our cities is an absolutely key part of the problem. So when we look at urban development, we need to find examples of best practice, and often the examples of best practice come from those areas which have seen the greatest challenge. And Melbourne is becoming rapidly a city showing the best practice on water conservation. It's being forced on them. By the way, important to understand that land is often a way of acquiring water. So the aquifers, the non-saline aquifers under the land have been mined. And the companies, the water companies, such as PepsiCo, Coca-Cola, SAP Miller, Nestle, have been buying up land around the world and farming the water from these aquifers. These aquifers have been dried up. They're being farmed for water far more quickly than rainwater is replenishing them. And so what you're creating through farming these aquifers is a longer term problem. The challenge is coming over the next 10 years in terms of freshwater provision. Now, I could say, with water, we can take a city like Melbourne, it's right on the coastline, and the ocean is full of water. Why don't we just desalinate the water? And of course, that's a solution. In the state of Victoria, they are busy with water conservation measures, but they're also looking very closely at desalination. Desalination works, technology works, but it's a very energy-intensive process. So you shift your challenge from water provision to energy. But don't forget that we're also trying to produce food for a rising global middle class. And for food, we need water and energy as well. So what we are doing is conflating other problems. In South Australia, they have plenty of coal. So burning coal to make water is a perfectly feasible economic operation. You burn coal, you make carbon dioxide, you cause climate change. Oh, and climate change is the cause of desertification in Southern Australia. This is one of the predictions of climate science. So what you're doing is exacerbating the very problem that you're trying to solve with a solution. Let me give you a worse example of that. If you go to the Middle East, they are burning oil to make fresh water. If you go to Dubai and you have a glass of water, it's seawater that's been desalinated. They're burning oil to make that fresh water. How can they do that at $130 a barrel? The answer is oil is subsidized in the Middle East. It's only $5 a barrel. Now you could say the subsidy is there to help the people of the country to have cheap oil. But it has that perverse outcome that you can burn oil to make fresh water. And this is in a part of the world which has an excess of sunlight. Why do I say that? Solar energy can be used for converting seawater to fresh water. And yet there is not one large-scale practical example being used. There are small-scale, and they work perfectly well. But the driver for that has to be energy costs. And if you subsidize the energy, you remove the very driver that will create the solution that is needed. So we're faced with this whole set of problems. Why do I say conflict and terrorism? If you look at the Arab Spring, I'm going to suggest to you in a moment that this has its origins in what I'm talking about. The rapid rise in the urban middle class is driving through commodity demand to a situation, of course, that we've never seen before. On a planet that is already stressed to produce those commodities. So let me just develop that need. Here's the evidence. We might expect to see commodity prices going up if that is correct. So this is the MGI index, is the commodity price index, which takes a basket of commodities, which is food, minerals, and energy. So the key commodities for any society. Here's the big oil shock driven by the formation of OPEC and the recovery from that oil shock. These prices have been normalized for the 1990 period. Here's the rapid rise of the middle class, pushing up commodity prices. The commodity prices are now higher in real terms than they have been for more than 110 years. So what's driving up commodity prices, quite simply, is this rapid rise in demand from that urban middle class, and despite the turn down in economic growth, particularly of the Western economy. Now, I watch commodity prices quite carefully, and I must admit that at this point, 2007, I thought commodity prices would fall through the roof, fall through the floor, right? And the reason is, if you go back to the 1929 stock market crash, commodity prices collapsed. Why? Overproduction of commodities, nobody had the money, the commodity prices therefore fell. I believe the relatively rapid recovery of the Western economies after the stock market crash, 1929 to 1932, was off the back of cheap commodities. So it was a feedback effect of cheap commodities. And so many of us were expecting the same thing to happen here. But the prices shot up. So the downturn in demand from the Western economy, as our economy started stalling, was overwhelmed by this rapid rise in the Asia-Pacific region in particular. So what does that mean? Actually, that's quite a tough message to take out, because it means that we don't have an easy way out of this current crisis. It's not going to be delivered through cheap commodities. Cheap commodities are yesterday's game, right? Because for two things, rapid rise in the middle class, but also the cheap commodities have already been mined out. And so we're into an expensive commodity era. And that should make us rethink. But I'm going to suggest commodity prices are the best driver for change into the future as we move forward in time. Here's an analysis we made of just looking at oil prices. If we focus on oil prices, then we know that all of these developed countries and the rapidly emerging economies are heavily dependent on oil prices. Oil price back in 1998 was $15 a barrel. This is all in real terms. $15 a barrel when global production of oil was about 64 million barrels a day. This is crude oil. Production increased to meet demand at 75 million barrels a day by 2005, and the price rose to $40 a barrel. And the economists would describe this as normal elastic behavior. You've got more demand and you're pushing up the price, but there's still lots of oil. Then something else happened. So all of my data points in blue are before 2005, and all of the data points in black after 2006. So what happened in 2005-2006 is that crude oil production reached a maximum. We have not yet exceeded 75 million barrels a day in 2014. Right? So we have hit a maximum in crude oil production. Demand keeps pushing up. Prices rise against a wall of production, $140, $130 a barrel. I do not believe prices can come down again until we have an alternative to oil for transport systems. So where is demand today for oil? Demand today for oil is at 93 million barrels a day. So 93 million barrels a day is way off my graph here. In other words, crude oil production, that's cheap stuff. That's the oil that comes shooting out of the ground. You just put a bucket underneath, catch it and sell it. That's the cheap stuff. All right? Crude oil production stalled here, and demand keeps rising, and demand is the difference between 75 and 93 million barrels a day has to be met from tar sands, from 2 miles down in the Gulf of Mexico. This is from non-normal crude production processes. These are all very expensive processes, and it means that oil production can carry on forever as long as we're prepared to keep paying higher and higher prices. Now, what do these prices do to us? I can tell you in 2005, when prices were down here, the Italian economy was in the balance, on its balance of payments. Today, the Italian economy is 40 billion euro per annum in the red deficit. The increased cost of imported oil to Italy is 40 billion euro per annum. The deficit in their balance of payments is entirely attributable to the increased cost of imported oil. Any country that is importing oil is now suffering economically because of this rapid rise. Again, a big driver for change. Technologically, we should be moving away from the notion of ground transport being driven by oil and looking for technological alternatives. That has to be the message, otherwise our economies will stall. The economy, if I go back to the Arab Spring, the Arab Spring suffered when this commodity price rise happened. In Egypt, the commodity prices that really hit people were food prices. Food prices increased threefold in 2005, 2007. And when food prices come through threefold more expensive for wheat and rice, it means that wealthy people don't even notice the difference, but the rapidly emerging middle class suddenly find that they cannot live according to their aspirations. And when I look at those aerial photographs of the people in Tahrir Square in Cairo protesting, those photographs show very ordered people sitting in rows protesting. This, I believe, is the educated middle class that is protesting. They are protesting because their expectations are not being delivered. And so when I look at these price rises, if we don't manage it, I think we're in for a really difficult time with dissatisfied, well-educated people whose expectations are not being realized. Well, I'm going to just say a few words about climate change because I happen to think this is the biggest challenge we're facing. So I quite like this curve. It's not often shown. It shows rising sea levels averaged for the whole planet, going back to 1860 up to the present time. Annual averages. Why is the sea level important? The sea level is actually a very good temperature indicator. As water expands, as water heats up, it expands, so it's a good thermometer. So if you like, this is simply a temperature axis here, and the sea level rising is indicated as effectively a global temperature rise. I like this because the data was actually taken from the time of the British Empire, and the British Empire existed around many parts of the world, and so essentially the Brits also measured everything in sight and made amazingly good records of what they'd measured. And the Proudman Institute in Liverpool managed to access all these records for sea levels around the coastline of the British Empire back in 1860. And they just translated that into data, more modern data, and then satellite data up there. What we see is, of course, that sea levels are continuing to rise faster and faster. This is a big challenge to island nations such as my own, but it's also an indicator of all of the climate challenges to all nations. And to turn this around is going to require action on a very short time scale. I just want to emphasize that point. The oceans are also being acidified, so half of the excess carbon dioxide being produced by burning fossil fuels and by eliminating forests, half of that increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere ends up in the oceans. And when you put carbon dioxide in the oceans, it forms carbonic acid, and so the acidity of the oceans is changing. This is actually quite frightening. The acidity change has only been measured since the 1990s, and already, because the pH is a logarithmic scale, the acidity has changed about 30%. Now, this is a real threat to marine life. We know that a very significant increase in pH is expected as we go through this century, and many people are now seeing that marine life is under severe threat as a result of that. I'm happy to answer questions, but it's not the topic of my conversation today. So let me just show you from the IPCC report what I consider to be the most important new graph that they present. This shows, going back to the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, the cumulative anthropogenic CO2 emissions giving rise to a cumulative emission into the atmosphere as a function of temperature rise, global average temperature rise. Now, if you accept, despite the bumps, this is roughly linear, that is roughly what the predictions say. So we can take the models, we can run them backwards in time, and run them forwards in time with error margins, and you see that the models give a good description back. Business as usual to the end of the century would therefore take us up to a temperature rise in the region of 4.5 degrees centigrade average. That's the best estimate, but there's still a 1% chance of a 6 degrees centigrade temperature rise. There's also a 1% chance that it will only be 3.5 degrees centigrade temperature rise. Now, as a chief scientific advisor to the British government, I was always having to look at worst outcomes and trying to avoid them. And the worst outcome here looks pretty bad. If we want to stay with the United Nations commitment, and I'm sure we all do, to stay below a 2 degrees centigrade temperature rise, we have to stop on this blue curve. And what this means is, in terms of the carbon budget, that we've already used up more than half our budget, and to achieve that means the following. At the moment, we are increasing greenhouse gas emissions at 1.8 to 2% per annum. If we get a good agreement, what does a good agreement mean in Lima, followed by Paris? In my view, it means the following. After 2020, we have to go from a 2% increase per annum to a 3.2% decrease per annum to stay within the carbon budget. 2020 becomes the key turning point. 3.2% per annum is deliverable, but only with focused action from all countries. If we carry on business as usual, when do we run out of our carbon budget to stay below 2 degrees centigrade? The answer is 2043. So if we carried on at 2% per annum increase, by 2043 we've run out of our carbon budget. This is today's problem. We have to have action, and we have to have action on a large scale. UK policy, and I think I was quite heavily involved with setting this out, is based on the following. 80% reduction in emissions by 2050. This is built into a Climate Change Act of Parliament with all party agreement. It cannot be changed by the government of the day. And we have a Climate Change Committee that is overseeing the process, reports to Parliament. not to the government. Now, 80% reduction. Why did I choose 80%? That wasn't a random number. It's compared with 1990 when we were emitting 10 tons of carbon dioxide per person per annum. By 2050, globally, we need to be at 18 billion tons of carbon dioxide per annum compared with today's figure of 36 billion. We need to halve to be on track on that 2 degrees centigrade. 18 billion tons of carbon dioxide per annum divided by 9 billion people means we each have a ration of 2 tons per person per annum. So British government policy is based on what we consider to be an equitable way forward, which is that all countries should aim to be at or less than 2 tons of carbon dioxide per person per annum by mid-century. That's the proposal that I'm carrying around the world with. We will defossilize our electricity grid by 2050. We're already on track to do that. Very important to say, we're on track. Large-scale infrastructure, every item of infrastructure we invest in now has to be fit for purpose after 2050, because it will still exist then. Otherwise, we are creating what we call white elephants. And we are going to have to transform the transport sector onto the electricity grid. And so all of this is now in train. We have a Department of Energy and Climate Change. We have one Secretary of State who's producing that. Now, what does this mean for different countries of the world? For OECD countries, business as usual would be along this line. This is the emissions per person as a function of time going forward to 2050. What I'm suggesting, every country should aim to be at 2 tons or less by 2050. OECD countries should be on this path, and that's the pathway that Britain is on. We're on a pathway that takes us to 52% reduction by 2028 and 80% reduction by 2050. For a country like China, which is still developing, we anticipate a continued increase in emissions, peaking and then falling down again. I believe China is preparing to announce the time when they will pass through a peak in their emissions. Their ambition is to fall below the 2-ton figure. So I believe China is happy with the trajectory of this climate. For less developed countries, of course, the peak in emission may come later, but as long as the trajectory is stretching towards that 2 tons, then globally we can manage the problem. So that's the suggestion I put on the table for an equitable way forward. How can we achieve this? Well, how do we manage the technology transfer? Now again, I'm going to suggest here that we're already on the way to achieving it. In Germany, in 1989, feed-in tariffs were introduced for electricity on the grid, where if you put photovoltaics on the roof of your house, any excess electricity you produce, you are guaranteed a price if you put it on the electricity grid. Now, initially, the feed-in tariffs had to be very high because the installation costs of photovoltaics were high. What the Germans did was propagated throughout the European Union. So the European Union has been using feed-in tariffs for some years now, and the result has been quite startling. The cost of installing photovoltaics has fallen from $70 per watt in 1976. Today, it's actually $0.50 per watt. The cost of installing photovoltaics has fallen by 17% for every doubling of production to meet demand. I believe this is Europe's most important contribution to the world. We have brought down for everybody the cost of photovoltaic installation to $0.50 a watt. For many, many parts of the world, particularly those that have lots of sunshine, we're not quite so blessed with as much sunshine as you are. for many parts of the world, it's already cheaper to install photovoltaics to produce electricity than any other form of energy installation, including, of course, coal, gas, and the like. So we're reaching a point where it becomes economically feasible to switch. With wind turbines, the fall has not been quite so rapid. The fall is about 9% for every doubling of production. But again, the fall has been very substantial. Now, how do we get to the point where this becomes taken up around the world? This slide is just emphasizing why we need to get there. If we divide the world up into OECD and non-OECD, the rapid rise in this new urban middle class means that it's the non-OECD countries that are really taking over and dominating the economy of the world. We are the old world, and this is the new world coming up. And if we don't get action across the world, this is what will happen. This is the International Energy Agency prediction. And then we're way off kilter in terms of managing climate change. But radical technologies, innovation there can reduce the cost of supply. This becomes critical. Why is this important to urban development? Because every building in the urban environment should be developing the energy it needs to run itself. As we move forward, the building itself becomes the energy source. I quote here Edison, who back in 1931 predicted that sun would be the major form of energy production. We've taken quite a long time to get around to it. But what we're saying is we need to get to this point where clean energy is less costly to produce than any other form of energy. So what do we need to do? It requires a major focus, a global focus of scientists, engineers, entrepreneurs in developing the technologies into the marketplace required to achieve that. And so we're putting forward the idea of a new global Apollo program, not to land a man on the moon, but to land humanity in a position where it can manage its own future in terms of energy production. So this is the IEA forecast of where we will be in terms of gigatons of carbon dioxide emitted per annum, and the required part is the green one. And you'll see that the turning point is roughly where we are now. Right? So we have very little time to make this transition. And so I've been putting forward with a group of senior colleagues in Britain the idea of this global Apollo program. The United Nations Secretary General is rather attracted by it. And the basis of this program is the following. All governments that wish to join, it's voluntary, the program, need to commit 0.02% of GDP to the program to join for 10 years. The object is to set up a consortium who will focus research, development, demonstration, and deployment funds in such a way that we achieve our objective. And the target is to see that by 2020, for every sunny nation, we have achieved this target of cheaper than any other form of energy, and in the rest of the world by 2025. So instead of landing a man on the moon, this is the target, that we overcome the need for fossil fuel energy by producing cheaper energy that is therefore going to be better for every country's GDP growth. Bottom line, we're not going to get agreement on this. We are all focused on this curve, photovoltaic cost coming down, but we haven't yet got real disruptive technology because all photovoltaics are still silicon. There's now a development of plastic photovoltaics. We want to see more investment in these alternatives. This could bring down the cost of photovoltaics on the outside of houses by a factor of 10 or 100. We can even envisage paint drying into a plastic photovoltaic. So when you design a house, you don't have to put photovoltaics in the form of silicon panels on the roof, you paint the house and it becomes an energy generator. So we need to focus on these new technologies. Now let me just say one more thing that I think is critically important for our new development, this circular economy idea. I talked recently on this subject in Manila, and I found this photograph of a waste tower in Manila. This waste is essentially plastic waste from plastic bags and plastic bottles. That plastic is valuable. We can recycle plastic to make all sorts of useful objects. And yet at the moment, we're still in that linear economy phase of the 20th century, where we take minerals and oil from the ground, convert it into marketable products, and then throw it away. In my view, the 21st century needs to be the century of the development of the circular economy. And the circular economy means that every manufacturer of marketable goods needs to focus on what happens when the marketplace is tired of the goods. How do you recover and remake and remanufacture from that good? So the circular economy is, in my view, the only way to deliver well-being for that rapid rise in the middle class I'm talking about, where we keep recovery rather than finding new minerals, new whatever. Now, I have a friend who's a Formula One car designer and developer par excellence, Gordon Marion. He took up the challenge. He's no longer with McLaren. He set up his own company. This is the world's first circular economy car. It looks like every other little city car, but let me tell you, it is only made from plastic bottles. The car is produced on the production line. The chassis is produced in 50 seconds. It's one piece of molded plastic. The average car that is still produced on a production line that looks like a Ford Model T Ford production line has 1,500 bolts in it. This car has no bolts. Right? The plastic covers are snapped on the car by the automatic process. You can drive the car 5.5 minutes after it was plastic bottled. If this car is in an accident, the passengers are protected as in Formula One technology, but not with fiber optic. These are protected by fiber plastic that has elastic response behavior. It's safer than any metal car going around. And in an accident, all the covers split away, and the passengers simply walk away. There's no need to bring a welding machine to cut out the passengers. You then pick up all the pieces and throw them into the beginning of the process, and you have a new car. Right? So this is new thinking. Let me just give you an example of new thinking in terms of urban waste. The city of New York. So, the citizens of the city of New York produce an average daily output of 1 billion grams of solid human waste. 1 billion grams of solid human waste, which is treated at great expense and put into the ocean, where it is causing nitrification of the oceans and again death of marine life. Every city in the world does this. I'm not blaming New York. Those 1 billion grams, 1% is nitrates and phosphates. The cost of nitrates and phosphates in the marketplace is very high. And we've done calculations which show the total cost of sewage treatment can be dealt with by extracting nitrates and phosphates and selling it to cover your expenses. The nitrates at the moment are produced by taking nitrogen from the atmosphere in what's called the Haber process. Nitrogen converted to nitrates eventually put into the soil. Phosphorus is dug out of the ground and made into phosphates, and that together makes fertilizer. We're continuing this process, which is the linear process. We eat the plants that come from that. We produce the solid waste and we throw it away. instead of extracting and making good use of it. The notion of the circular economy should change all of our thinking. It's a challenge to each one of the processes that we're involved in. How do we fly around? Fuel usage as kerosene in flying aircraft is a major challenge. Now, the old airship has a number of significant advantages. There's a British company that is now producing an airship that is aluminium cover. It's 150 meters by 50 meters in dimension, bigger than a football pitch. Okay? But what that means as an advantage is that if you put solar panels on the top of the airship, you have enough energy to drive the airship completely. All the energy you need night and day if you store with batteries produced from the photovoltaics on the top of the airship. The airship that I'm discussing with you can carry up to 50 tons in one design of freight, or 250 tons of freight in a bigger version, which takes up more space. I think this is the future. How do we move freight around our country in a way that meets all the challenges I'm discussing? Now, people said to me that these things move more slowly than a jumbo jet. That is true. And we in Britain eat tomatoes from Spain. So we did a calculation. They have wide-bellied jumbo jets being loaded up at airports in Spain, arms contributing from right across Spain. The jumbo jet is loaded up, it flies rapidly to an airport, lands, and then all the crates of tomatoes have to be loaded onto trucks and trains to be carried to depots for supermarkets. This doesn't need to land anywhere. It simply lowers the freight onto the roof of the depot where it's needed. Right, so you deliver the tomatoes to the places where it needs to go. You even collect the tomatoes in Spain from the places it needs to go. You reduce the time scale of delivery, even though the vehicle travels slower, and you reduce the cost by at least a factor of 10. If you use photovoltaics, you can reduce it by much more. Again, what we're thinking about is how do we move into that future if we only need to go into how do I start? Slowly, rapidly on. So let me just quickly say, cities are on the front line. So urban development in the Asia Pacific region, we're going to see 3.3 billion new urban dwellers in the Asia Pacific region. In Africa, 1.3 billion by 2050. This is where we need to be planning. This is the opportunity. It's a massive opportunity if we can develop the mechanisms for getting this right. When we look at energy usage, this is a fascinating curve, I think, because if you plot the private transport energy use per person against energy, the density of the city, most of us would guess that it should be a straight line, or roughly a straight line. It's a hyperbolic curve. In other words, because of the nature of this curve, there's a sweet spot where urban density is basically optimized, where you can optimize around mass transit, where you can optimize around walkability and cyclability and so on. The cities that use most energy per person are all the cities that were done after the arrival of the car, the automobile. Right, so what the world's champion is Houston, which is the lowest density city in the world, and where people spend, believe it or not, 7 days a week, an average of 3 hours a day in their car. Average. So where does lifestyle, human well-being fit into this urban environment? The medieval cities of Europe, I believe, are the exemplars of urban development going into the 21st century, because they were designed for ease of freight and individual transport. They were designed before the period of cars. Not many people had horses even. Most people were walking. So we have relatively high density cities, multifunctional in each region of the city, with parks for playgrounds, with shopping and so on. So multifunctional, walkable, cyclable cities is what's being returned to our medieval cities. We are refashioning them to open up big walking areas only, big cycling areas only. We don't have to go all the way down to the level of density of Hong Kong to achieve all of these advantages. So, getting smart about new urban development means actually looking backwards in time at where the best exemplars are. The picture I'm showing here surely doesn't exist in your country. Do you have big countries, Japan? Throughout the world, we have become so fixated on getting from A to B by car that we have simply created the same problem in every single urban environment. And your near neighbor Bogota had a mayor that came up with a very simple solution. So when I was in India recently, I took off the headline on this, and I asked people to guess where in the world the left-hand city was and where in the world the right-hand city was. They all thought this was somewhere in India, and that was somewhere in the Western world. This, of course, is both before and after in Bogota, same vantage point, so the same high-rise flat, same picture shown. And this before the introduction by Enrique Peñalosa of his draconian policy on cars coming into the city. You will know that they have 5-lane highways each way going into the city of Bogota, over the city. He announced the outer lane in future is a pedestrian walkway. The next lane is for bicycles only. The next lane is for buses only that make many stops through the city. The next lane, fast buses that make a few stops. And the last lane is if you still insist on bringing your car into the city. Now, of course, it made it very difficult for people to get into the city. But the private sector came up rapidly with the bus mass transit system. It's an exceptional system. I'm sure many of you have been to Bogota. These long buses, they look like to us like London Underground trains. Very efficient. So that picture taken 3 years later of the same pavement, here, vertical parking on the pavement, pedestrians having to dance out into the road, risking their lives. Here the pedestrians have taken back the pavement. Those linear walkways became places for people to parade themselves. These are these linear parkways now, they've become greenways. And you see that the people of Bogota had virtually forgotten that their city was surrounded by mountains. There's another difference between the before and after picture. The cutting down on the urban traffic has health advantages, enormous health advantages. People are actually talking to each other in buses, in mass transit as well. And so you get a different cultural environment. Now, we set up an organization, and I'm going to leave you with this, to try and provide a global hub for best practice in urban development. The thing is called Future Cities Capital. I am the chairman. They're quite generously funded by the British government, but it's a not-for-profit company, so we're not part of the government. And within, at the moment, we're about 50 staff. In about a year's time, we'll be plateauing at about 100 staff. And the idea is to provide both an engine to drive the hub, so we have exchange of best practice around the world, but also we're moving into a building in central London that is big enough to invite people from around the world to share the space with us, to talk about what urban development is needed to look like in the 21st century to make our urban environment fit for purpose, by which I mean putting human well-being at the top and sustainability just below. So So here's what we're doing. We're creating a global hub, a laboratory. So it's not just a hub. We have large-scale computing facilities. We believe we'll be able to set up in our computer any city in the world and then play with its development in the computer. We are assembling a whole range of policy influencers, makers, private sector players, academics, financiers. Critically important to get all of these people together. And of course, in the City of London, we have a major financial centre, so that becomes important. That's the object, future-proof cities, to contribute to the challenges of poverty eradication, natural resource depletion, and ecosystem protection in the face of all these increases in urban population and collaborate on financial measures. So that's what I was here just to advertise. We're only 1 year old. I took over the chairmanship after traveling around many cities in the world just in May last year. But within the next 6 months, we should be fully up and running. And we're keen to be talking to people like yourself. Thank you.
Bien, quiero agradecer al señor Sir David King, excelente charla, estoy seguro que las personas asistentes tienen preguntas, así que lo que vamos a hacer es pasarles el micrófono inalámbrico y yo le voy a prestar este micrófono. ¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta?
Bueno, muchísimas gracias por la presentación. Yo quería preguntarle cómo se compatibiliza todo este desarrollo en una línea más humana, con una concepción medioambiental, con el principio de maximizar ganancias de muchas empresas. Creo que ahí está uno de los principales problemas.
¿Sí?
El principio de muchas empresas hoy en día es maximizar ganancias. No importa mucho si esto tiene consecuencias medioambientales, consecuencias en términos de lo que puede hacer la emisión de gases de efecto invernadero. Y las tecnologías que se desarrollan están basadas en ese principio de maximizar ganancias. Entonces, todo este proceso de desarrollo es un cambio de actitud que deberían tener muchas de las empresas que producen estos bienes, ¿no es cierto?, de consumo.
Okay, I think I've understood it. But stop me if you think I have misunderstood. This is, I think, very much a question around capex against running costs. Very often, a building that meets high environmental standards is much cheaper to run, but more expensive to build. And so the challenge becomes explaining to the purchaser of the building the advantages in these low running costs running into the future. So any building that has passive air conditioning, passive heating, produces its own electricity, is obviously going to be cheaper to run. I think that what we're discussing here is critical. The capital cost is often the only thing the purchaser is looking at. How do I reduce my capital cost? We need to introduce into everybody's thinking that running cost is a critical parameter as well. We lose the battle every time if we don't focus on that. In the British government, we have handled this in several ways. Now, when you buy or sell a building, the energy usage has to be set out. So if I buy a house from somebody else, the amount of energy and the cost of running the house has to be set out to me, the buyer. So that was a new legislation to meet what I think your challenge is. But at the same time, we also introduced building regulations in Britain, which, for example, in 2005, we set out a regulation saying after 2016, no building can be constructed in Britain that uses net electricity from the grid. So in other words, each building has to generate enough electricity to run itself. It can sell excess to the grid, and it can take that much back. Government regulation, I suppose, is the big answer to the question.
You mentioned people participation. What do you think about middle class participation? Middle class participation in the future. What do you think should be there?
It's a very central question, and I give my personal opinion on that. If we can undergo a cultural transition that is fitting to the 21st century demand, it really means that we understand that consumerism in itself is not a good. What is good is improvement in human well-being. And so any consumer behavior that we encourage ought to be focused around human well-being. Now, having said that, that's such a big challenge because every manufacturer wants to sell their goods, and in order to sell their goods, they advertise them in a very attractive way. And so I may have a perfectly good car, and then I look at an advertisement and I see a much nicer one. I may have a functional watch, I see an advertisement and I see one that looks more attractive. So it's actually an enormous challenge, the question that you raised. But I fear that super consumerism, which consumerism was very good in the development of the 20th century economy, so I'm not criticizing that, but it has now grown into super consumerism, which is not really relevant to our well-being. It's not really relevant to our cultural behavior either. So, but you're now asking me a question that is the most difficult of all to answer.
Buenos días, agradecida por toda la información que nos ha podido dar, pero me interesa saber algo y es justamente sobre este consumismo en el siglo XXI. Tenemos un gran problema que los grandes países que están con el problema de efecto invernadero no han hecho nada por solucionar el problema. Y por otra parte, ¿cómo podemos solucionar este impedimento que quisiéramos hacer para que siga subiendo la temperatura? ¿Cuál sería nuestra conciencia a nivel nacional, a nivel local y a nivel mundial? En ese momento, la preocupación está justamente en este efecto invernadero. ¿Cuál va a ser nuestra realidad tomando en cuenta los efectos que vamos a seguir teniendo? Y por otro lado, ¿qué va a hacer el G8? El caso de Inglaterra, el caso de la China fundamentalmente, o la India, que están con grandes problemas, así como Estados Unidos. Gracias.
You're asking again a very big question and a very important one. I think that the first thing to understand for all of us living on this planet, that this is our challenge. That we cannot point to other groups of people and say it's up to them to solve this. Voltaire, if I may quote Voltaire, said, this is a challenge to the translator, no snowflake in an avalanche ever feels responsible. So this is a global problem, and each one of us is responsible for finding ways forward. I have worked very closely with several least developed countries. For 5 years I was not in government, and I did this work there. The government of Rwanda has a green growth and climate resilience policy built into every ministry of government. I had 9 people there for a year, each one working in a different ministry, one in the president's office. That program was passed the first time by the cabinet because all of the ministers had spent 1 year with us working on this policy. The government of Rwanda is dealing with a country that has an income level which is roughly half of that of Bolivia, but the improvement in human well-being is matching that of Bolivia. Again, they have a president who is completely committed to the improved well-being of the people. And the green growth policy could not have been introduced if it meant any threat to the improvement of the human well-being there. In fact, what we had to show to the government was that every step of this policy would improve the well-being of the population. So, for example, Rwanda was importing oil, burning diesel to make electricity. Unlike Bolivia, they don't have a lot of hydropower. Burning diesel to make electricity is extremely expensive. So we found they have plenty of geothermal energy, they have plenty of access to sunlight, and so using photovoltaic and geothermal energy, they can use their hard-earned dollars to put Rwandans to work to create the energy they need. So every aspect of the green growth program for Rwanda is aimed at improving the GDP and the well-being of the country. Now, I don't see why that shouldn't apply to all countries. My own country, Britain, is also focused on improving GDP growth, and as we switch out of fossil fuels, we're making sure that we do it to the benefit of everyone in the country. So I think my bottom line is we have to find, and it's hard work, ways forward. In this country, I think sadly, deforestation continues at a tremendous rate. I understand the drive to allow deforestation for soya and cattle because that improves the well-being of the farmers and improves everybody's GDP. But I can't believe there isn't a better way to improve the GDP of this country. It's not that I know how to do it, but I believe there should be a consolidated effort to say, those forests are far too precious. You shouldn't let them go. And for every country, the challenge is different. Just as for every city, the challenge is different.
Good morning. I'm interested in your view on how we should prepare our children for this future.
It's all about our children, but for somebody of my age, it's about my grandchildren. Future generations. The idea, of course, has to be that we take responsibility until we can pass the responsibility on to them to see that the urban environment that is created is suitable for their lives? How do we talk to our children about this? I think it's critically important to create generations of people who understand the attractions of well-being as distinct from the seduction of this super consumerism. That's the challenge to every parent, and let me say that.
Muchas gracias por compartir su experiencia valiosa y estas interesantísimas propuestas. He visto que la propuesta de la economía circular es muy interesante, también todos los avances tecnológicos. Quisiera hacerle una pregunta. Muchas de estas tecnologías producidas en el norte, fruto de una acumulación no solamente de conocimientos, sino también de recursos económicos. ¿Cuán factible ve usted de que estas tecnologías puedan ser transferidas en los países, pero que no estén dentro de un circuito masivo, que no tenga un costo? Esa es una pregunta. Y la otra pregunta es, me parece sumamente interesante estos nuevos paradigmas que están creando de ciudad, sociedad. Sin embargo, hay algunas cifras y una activista llamada Climático las ha mencionado hace un tiempo, se llama las cifras del terror. Y él dice de que las cifras del terror no solamente está que vamos a superar los grados de temperatura, sino también de que nuestro presupuesto de carbono, está en peligro porque las reservas inscritas en los mercados por el uso de combustibles fósiles, si se usaran, superarían ese presupuesto de carbono a 2.700. Entonces, hay esta tendencia muy interesante, renovadora, que está cercana a defender la vida, pero por otro lado hay una estructura muy frágil de inversiones de mercado que está amenazando por seguir usando más cargas de
I think I got the first part of your question, but not quite the second part. So let me first deal with the technology, and then I may come back to clarification. What is interesting about the feed-in tariff of Europe? First of all, I didn't mention this probably cost European governments about 0.1 to 0.2% of GDP to bring down the cost of photovoltaic production through volume of production increasing. And this is a contribution to the world because everybody benefits. That's a key part of technology transfer. Right? So wherever you are in the world, it now only costs $0.50 a watt to install photovoltaic energy. But the second part of it is also an interesting point to make. I think it's relevant to your question. When Germany began feed-in tariffs, there's no doubt in my mind that they thought they would become the photovoltaic producers for the whole world, that they would benefit from the manufacturing and the sale of those goods around the world. The world's biggest single producer of photovoltaics is Han Energy in China today. And as a matter of fact, China produces most of today's photovoltaics. The rapidly emerging economies are very well positioned to benefit from the manufacturing side of the equation as well. And so when we look at what further technologies we need, I'm trying to encourage developing countries to look at becoming the manufacturer of those technologies. There's no reason why they shouldn't. The missing technology at the moment is large-scale energy storage. Right? And so one focus for this commission that I want to set up is to invest in research, development, demonstration, and deployment of large-scale energy storage. So that any country that has plenty of sunlight and perhaps desert can store the energy at night and produce a constant supply of energy for their grids once you crack large-scale energy storage, I can see no reason to carry on using fossil fuels. Now, as I say, I kind of lost your second question. I don't know if it can be summarized very quickly.
Leí un artículo hace un año de un activista que se llama norteamericano a favor de climática, de estabilizar la temperatura. Y la información que él daba es de que nuestro presupuesto de carbono que tenemos ahora es alrededor de 5 gigatonnes, es lo que podemos estimar. Pero lo que él dice es que las bolsas de mercado han inscrito reservas, valores de reservas entre el petróleo, el gas, toda esta industria combustibles fósiles, de usarse, contaminarían alrededor de 2.700 millones de personas, 5 veces más del presupuesto que tenemos. Entonces, estas iniciativas de transitar hacia una tecnología son muy buenas, pero están también de alguna manera bajo el peligro de ir dominando el mundo, vinculado a los mercados.
So I think my answer is much shorter than the question. Basically, the point of my new global Apollo program is to reach that sweet spot when it will always be cheaper to install renewable energy sources for energy than it will be for fossil fuels, and therefore the object of the exercise is to leave most of the fossil fuels in the ground. When we talk about carbon capture and storage, for example, as a technology, what we're actually doing is putting the carbon back into the ground. Now, I'd like to leave it there in the first place. Right? So I think your comment is absolutely right. We cannot, within our carbon budget of 2 degrees, we cannot continue to burn those fossil fuels that are available to us. But I'm suggesting the simplest way to achieve this is to get there economically with an alternative.
Thank you for your presentation, Mr. King, and to the organizers for setting up this event. Here. Right. So actually my question is about the Global Apollo program. If you could comment a bit more about it. And about the scale, you mentioned that it's 0.02% of GDP required from developed countries, non-developed countries, and it doesn't seem like it's much. I mean, it's ambitious, but it seems like it could be realized. And I wanted to ask you, what would the barriers and enabling conditions be in order to have a successful project?
It is a very ambitious scheme, and it may not sound ambitious that 0.02% of GDP is aimed at not frightening off the major economies. Right? I want participants, and they may end up spending more, but this is up to them. The 0.02% would be the minimum required to join the consortium. The consortium will drive the program, so anyone who's contributing that 0.02% will be driving the program forward. And each country will spend the money in the way they deem fit for them to spend. Right? So it's a relatively free-for-all process, but the consortium will determine where the money should be spent. Now, you're asking a question about scale. At the moment, globally, we are spending around $4 billion a year on alternative energy research and development, renewable energy research and development. The total subsidy for fossil fuels today around the world, I mentioned the subsidies in the Middle East, is estimated at $455 billion a year. So the amount of research into renewable energy doesn't even begin to come close to this enormous subsidy that a number of governments have been playing. Let me just very quickly say, the Indian government has stopped its coal subsidies. They realized they were subsidizing not the poor people of India, they were subsidizing the wealthy people with cheap energy. And so now they've introduced an alternative scheme to assist the poor people with energy. So it's a big step forward, but we've got a long way to go. This scheme would only raise about $20 billion a year. But our calculation is $20 billion a year spent wisely over 10 years will easily manage this problem. Right? In other words, we believe this is all that is required to get into the marketplace the energy storage and technologies, the energy transmission technologies that we need, because we already have reached that point where photovoltaic installation is so cheap. Even the wind turbine installation for windy areas is very competitive today. So I think that it's quite surprising that $20 billion a year is what it will take to crack this problem. Oh, you asked me a question about developing countries and developed countries. We're simply, this is, although I'm hoping it will be announced at the United Nations Secretary General's meeting, this is not a United Nations procedure. It's a voluntary procedure. And I would be really delighted if India, China, and Bolivia would join up with us in this program of work. It's meant to be an engaging process so that we all take ownership of the outcome.
Bueno, nosotros somos de la red política y bueno, queremos consultar el cambio climático, cómo estaría afectando actualmente a nuestro país, pronóstico cómo va a ir afectando a la larga debido a lo que hemos atravesado por las inundaciones. También tenemos en cuenta que los nevados tienen un tiempo de vida de 50 años, ¿verdad?
First of all, let me say that in the British Meteorological Office, we have the world's best capacity. This is a large-scale physics program that predicts the climate for the whole planet. And it predicts tomorrow's weather and the climate in 80 years' time. It's all one model. It includes greenhouse gases. We are the only meteorological prediction system that includes greenhouse gases in the modeling. It's done on a 12 by 12 kilometer pixel scale. The reason I'm saying this is that any country can have access to the output of our meteorological office. It does cost money, right? So in order to focus on a given geographical area, we need to use high-resolution forecasting. Just to give you an illustration as to how good the forecasting is, we have, over the last 2 years, developed a proven capacity to predict every extreme major weather event that has occurred in the world with 6 days warning. So if you take Hurricane Haiyan, the Met Office predicted within 12 kilometers where landfall would take place, within 1 hour when it would take place, and predicted the ferocity with amazing accuracy. They were able to give that information to the Philippines government 6 days in advance, and Britain sent a rescue ship to the Philippines that arrived 2 days before the hurricane. The capability of prediction of this system is easily the best in the world, but it does mean that for any country that wishes to examine what adaptation measures are required, we can play out in 2050, 2080, what climate impacts are likely to occur in your country under different scenarios of greenhouse gas emissions. In your country, you are likely to lose all glaciers by 2020. In your country, you have visible changes from climate change. I believe that's why the Bolivians are so aware of the problem of climate change. Peruvians as well. They look at the Andes and see the glaciers moving up the mountain. You no longer can ski. The icon of your city is the Three Peak Mountain. Will it forever be covered by snow? I don't believe that it will. But the impact on your people is from the runoff waters that are currently used for farms. So there is a very severe potential impact. If you adapt, it means planning for those impacts. The rainfall is not going to change. So in other words, instead of it being frozen and only released in the summer months, it will be released through the year. And it means storing the water in new ways so that the farmers can have the water when they need it. So that would be a major adaptation policy for this region. But your question requires much more detailed analysis. It could be made available, and I believe every country needs an adaptation policy.
Deseo, en primer lugar, felicitarle por el enorme conocimiento que tiene sobre el tema que acaba de hacernos escuchar. Lo que yo quería era comentarle un poco en cuanto a algunos aspectos que nos ha comentado, por ejemplo, lo que sucede con los países en vías de desarrollo. Por ejemplo, usted nos dice que se producirá un auto que no va a usar mucho tornillo. ¿Qué va a pasar con los que fabrican tornillos? No se usará mucha soldadura. ¿Qué va a pasar con los soldadores? O sea, llega un momento que estamos nosotros que hay que darle mucho caso al libro de Charles Piketty sobre el capital en el siglo XXI. O sea, donde él habla de que se está súper concentrando los capitales y lamentablemente eso hace que las economías de escala sobresaturan los mercados. Hasta ahí nosotros lo que tenemos es justamente una economía de obsolescencia. Antiguamente comprábamos un portaúñas inglés o alemán que nos podría durar 20 años. Ahora compramos un portaúñas chino que nos dura 3 días, 3 cortes. Entonces, ¿qué sucede? Que tendremos que reciclar todo. ¿Hasta qué punto el volumen que tenemos que reciclar es muy serio? Y el problema que ataca, o sea, con el calentamiento global, ya le vamos a dar la razón a Al Gore. Al Gore no le daba la razón, pero creo que ahora sí, porque cada vez nos damos cuenta perfecta de que hay una emisión muy grande de polución. Esa emisión, lo que se dice, es antropogénica, sí, pero ahora, ¿cómo nosotros nos repartimos la carga de ese problema? Porque se ha hablado, por ejemplo, de cuotas de emisión. Los países que emiten más, vamos a pagar a los países en vías de desarrollo nuestra cuota de emisión. Yo quisiera que un poco nos explique ese aspecto.
That was a useful comment, and I will not respond really. I think you made your comment very well. Thank you.
Bueno, quiero agradecer por su excelente exposición. Hay un tema que está en vigente ahora, que es que el gobierno está pensando utilizar la energía nuclear para fines pacíficos y para la creación de energía. Yo quisiera saber cuál es su opinión.
In terms of nuclear energy, I can speak in some detail about the British situation because I do not think we can achieve zero carbon policy by 2050 without nuclear energy. So I am one of the proponents of nuclear new build in Britain, and we are in that process now of building new nuclear power stations. The extent of nuclear power in Britain will partly depend on public acceptability, and that is the big issue with nuclear power. And it will partly depend on the rapidity of rollout of alternative renewable energy sources. But I expect that we could be achieving something like 30 to 40% of our total power from nuclear by 2050. But to generalize your question, nuclear power has proved to be the safest form of electricity production in the world today, by which I mean the number of fatalities per kilowatt hour is way, way lower than any other form of energy production. Now, the reason I believe that is the case is because it's the most dangerous. Because it's the most dangerous, it had to be regulated extremely carefully. Equally, the most dangerous way to travel is by air, but it is the safest, right? So, because airplanes have to be so carefully regulated. So there's a contradiction that is overruled by practice. But we've had the recent Fukushima disaster. It's not a disaster as such of nuclear energy. As today stands, not one person has died of radiation exposure from the Fukushima disaster. But nevertheless, for Japan, it's a disaster. 55 nuclear power stations have been put on standby. It's a big challenge to their economy not to be producing electricity from those power stations. Now, seismicity, the activity, the geological activity is the problem. And I believe that every nuclear power station needs to be examined in terms of potential damage from seismic activity before it is turned on again. Now, many of the power stations in Japan are not potentially in danger from seismic activity, and I believe could be turned on again. But if you take me around the world, I would say, in general, nuclear power is a relatively safe form of energy production, provided we manage very, very tough regulatory measures. A long answer.
Muchas gracias. Estoy seguro que con un invitado con tanto conocimiento y con una propuesta tan interesante como la del proyecto Apolo, podríamos hablar mucho tiempo más. Sin embargo, hemos llegado a nuestro límite. Desde el Observatorio La Paz, ¿Cómo vamos? Queremos agradecer mucho a la Embajada Británica y esperamos poder seguir trabajando en un futuro. Y los invitamos a que degusten de un refrigerio en la sala del frente. Gracias.